Welcome to Crime Beyond Borders from the Journal of Illicit Economies and Development and the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime. My name is John Collins and I'm Editor-in-Chief of the journal. In this episode, I'm delighted to say that we're joined by the pre-eminent scholar of global drug markets, Professor Peter Reuter. Professor Reuter is a distinguished university professor in the School of Public Policy and Department of Criminology at the University of Maryland. He was also founding president of the International Society for the Study of Drug Policy and has published prolifically on topics of drugs, organised crime, money laundering, and numerous other topics.
My interest was illegal markets, and by the early 80s, it was clear that drugs constituted the largest illegal market. I started at the Rand Corporation in 1981, and an opportunity came to study illegal drug markets, and that was just a sort of natural extension of my interests. And I was interested in the markets, and that eventually led to an interest in drug policy more generally.
If I was to try to sum up the oscillations you might have witnessed, right, is that it strikes me that drug policy over the last, let's even say half a century, is in some ways a search for an easy answer, a silver bullet easy answer, right? There's one way to manage the issue. And we've kind of gone from the archetype of the war on drugs approach of the, let's say, 1980s through a very, very different paradigm now, which also offers a kind of, well, there's one answer, or maybe there's two answers, which might be harm reduction and legalization. What do you think about that, or have I completely misframed it?
No, I think that there's always a search for easy answers. Nuance is complicated, and public discussion avoids complications. I think harm reduction is unquestionably a big sort of intellectual breakthrough. It's not unique to drug policy, but it's a much more important element of drug policy discussions than of, for example, driving. I mean, harm reduction in a way for economists first became prominent in discussions about the effects of mandatory seatbelts. And there's sort of classic studies by University of Chicago economists which showed that mandatory seatbelts and other ways of making cars safer led to more accidents but less damage, because with seatbelts, people felt that their driving was safer, as indeed it was. They tended to speed more. They'd have more accidents, but the accidents would have less damage, harmful consequences. And so the idea of harm reduction is, way before it enters drug policy, but it's become central to drug policy discussions. And I think it's undoubtedly helpful, but that it's helpful. It's not a solution. And while I think that it's good that the limitations and harms of tough drug enforcement are now part of the standard discourse and not simply sort of the fringe reformers' discourse, I think that's still an incomplete understanding of drug policy. I mean, so let me sort of step back and sort of give an example of just how drastically, even in the hawkish US, the dialogue has changed by referring to a report in the Trump administration. Now, the Trump administration had no taste for harm reduction, but when former Governor Chris Christie, chaired a commission on drug policy, sort of spurred by the opioid crisis, and I think it was 2018 that the report came out, maybe 2019, I think 18. The report absolutely was dominated by public health issues and barely anything to say about tougher law enforcement. And given that Chris Christie himself was a former prosecutor, a very aggressive one, not in any sense a reformer, I thought it was just remarkable that there would be so little attention to tougher enforcement as a way of dealing with the US opioid crisis. I would take that as indicating just how much the war on drugs rhetoric has sort of moved from the center of discussion. There clearly are fringe groups that press that, but the mainstream is no longer expecting that tough enforcement will accomplish much. I want to be careful. I mean, the Trump administration certainly reinstated some elements of the war on drugs. I mean, Jeff Sessions, as Attorney General, reversed the previous Attorney Generals, Lynch and Holder, who had pushed prosecutors to seek sort of minimal charges rather than maximal charges. Sessions pushed for maximal charges against drug dealers. But I think the numbers show a decline in the number of prosecutions and the numbers sentenced for drug offences. And generally, the share of incarceration in the US that results from drug offences has gone down substantially over the last 10 years at least. And of course, with cannabis legalization, the numbers will go down still more, but it holds for other drugs as well.
Yeah, and to say in harm reduction as somebody coming of age, as an early career academic in the field, there's a lot to admire about it as a paradigm and its achievements. Right, it's one thing that did what it said it would. It did what it said it would do on the tin. Right, it as a public health measure, it was actually effective. When you look at so many other drug policy interventions, they just clearly haven't worked. I think we get to a point in the discussions where you get to diminishing returns. It's like harm reduction is a very important tool in the case, and indeed legalization seems to be an increasing one. But neither are sufficient, right? And how do you find that balance between a holistic drug policy and just kind of fixating on one element, just like the paleo drug warriors did on enforcement back 20 or 30 years ago?
Perhaps this is a time for me to sort of say something about my critique of public health thinking on drug policy. I think the hostility to anything connected to the criminal justice system has become problematic. I mean, there is a role for supply reduction. I agree that there has been a real problem with policing and drug enforcement, that it has been used in particular against vulnerable communities. There's a huge amount of injustice. But that isn't to deny that it is important to maintain some level of pressure and think strategically about that pressure against drug markets. And the public health approach now is to regard all that as harmful and without potential benefit. I mean, I will say that I'm involved in editing of a journal where we have received commentaries that are extremely critical of an article which found a positive consequence from drug enforcement because that article failed to identify all the ways in which drug enforcement had created harms. You have to start with the sort of full bill of charges against drug enforcement before you can find anything positive, and it would be better if you didn't find anything positive, is sort of the attitude. And I think that creates problems. There is a legitimate role for drug enforcement.
Well, let me put a controversial one on, because I think we're coming from the same perspective of, we're both active in academic spheres in drug policy. And I think I gave a lecture at the LSE a couple of weeks ago, and the guy running the course, it's not a secret, Dr. Mike Shiner, who's at the LSE, he was saying, a lot of what I was saying was contrarian, or I was, is in some ways controversial. But realistically, it's that I think we are getting to a point where there's certain orthodoxies, which I think even for people who do come from a reform perspective, and I certainly would see myself as coming from a reform perspective, but there's certain, should we say, revealed truths or orthodoxies of thought which need to be challenged a little bit, right? And I think that's, you're highlighting one of them. If I was to give another, and I think you would be familiar with this discussion around colonialism, right? This idea that drug policy is innately colonialist. Well, as a historian of drug policy, that's a difficult statement to make and to justify, right? If anything, prohibitions in the international regime on a historical reading were an anti-colonial endeavor. And that's the point that I've made in a number, I've written a book on this recently, I've made the point in a number of events. If you look at the states that were most vigorously pushing for repressive hardline drug policies after World War II, it was not, well, the US to a significant degree was, but you look at Singapore, you look at Malay, you look at the post-colonial states, there's a reason why these countries were pushing very, very hardline prohibitionist policies, is that they were regulated drug markets were associated with colonization. So that's just to make a pedantic point, but I think I consistently come across this argument which is stated as truth, right? Drug policy equals colonization equals racism. It's like, well, yes, in very significant ways it often does, but not in a uniform sense. So what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you another standard truth that is clearly very questionable, which is that prohibition always leads to stronger forms of drugs. And you look at cannabis legalization in the United States, and it just completely contradicts that. Cannabis potency was probably around 10% in illegal markets. In legal markets, putting aside vape, which are, of course, much higher potency, the potency in most legal markets averages close to 20%. Yet it's still, articles are still published in which it just is asserted that prohibition leads to more potent and dangerous forms of drugs.
Right, the iron law of prohibition, it's called, right?
Iron law. Thank you. I'd forgotten the phrase. Yes, the iron law of prohibition. Well, not so. With the one true test we've had of that contradicted the iron law.
And so maybe if we were to dive a little bit further into, we now have a lot of experiments which have run for, in some cases, almost 8 to 9 years of legalized cannabis regimes. What do you think? Is it too soon still to draw lessons, or do you think we're at a point where we can actually have some?
Well, I am reluctant. I do think that these are almost generational changes. I've always thought that a central question is how families will deal with the upbringing of children in this new regime. To what extent will parents think that amongst the many things they need to teach their children, it is how to treat legal cannabis? Just as parental advice about drinking is an important part of formation of drinking behavior and family. Not just family lessons, but sort of how the family itself treats drinking. I have a story from a long time ago that may be relevant here in making the argument. So this was years ago. I had lunch with a Dutch official. I think it was Ministry of Justice official, and he actually smoked marijuana at lunch, which somewhat surprised me. And he talked about an American friend of his, a close friend, whose son had come to Amsterdam and reveled in the access to legal cannabis. And the Dutch man said, I, of course, had told my children the right way to use cannabis. We always had it as a supplement to the after-dinner brandy that we had, and I wasn't particularly interested in the specific lesson that, but this notion that sort of as a father, he had a responsibility to teach his child how to use the drug responsibly, which is sort of really, I think it was a vivid image for me. And maybe I think too much of parental upbringing, but that's one reason to sort of hesitate to draw inferences from what we've observed so far. The other thing is that the prices keep on falling, and surely that's going to make a difference. I mean, cannabis prices could really collapse. I mean, the cost of producing cannabis is trivial, and with efficient distribution, it could become a very, very cheap intoxicant. And so I think until we see how the prices equilibrate, whether they do continue to fall, we should be hesitant about the effect. On the other hand, I mean, I do think we're learning that it's not having much of an effect on the extensive margin, that is on prevalence amongst youth, but that it probably is increasing the intensity of use. And there could be real harms associated with that. I mean, I don't know the literature well enough. I've not, I mean, as I said, my interest is illegal markets. I'm a lot less interested in cannabis than I used to be. I've really only maintained interest in the interaction between the legal and the illegal markets. So I've not followed in detail the work on the extent of cannabis-related problems. I do know that the intensity of use has increased, but I don't know the extent to which that has generated more cannabis use disorders.
And what about then the impact on criminal markets? Again, to take a truism of drug policy, you legalize, you remove the criminality from the markets. Is that what we're seeing?
Well, we're certainly seeing a sharp decline in illegal markets. It takes longer than I expected. I thought that in Canada, the illegal markets would have collapsed within a couple of years, but that didn't. I remember that something like, I can't remember whether it's 1/3 or 1/2 of the market continued to be served by illegal providers up, the 2 years after the legalization. It's clear that the legal market is gradually displacing the illegal. And in states where it's legal, the illegal providers are now selling more interstate than intrastate.
And I know you've done some work on this previously, but if we think further afield, right, the impact that, say, legalization of cannabis had on Mexican cartels early on, can we extrapolate that to other markets? The highly unlikely scenario of a legalized cocaine market, but could we make further extrapolations from it, or do you think it's too early?
No, I really do think the markets are distinct. I don't think there's endless. I think that legalizing the methamphetamine market, legalizing cocaine, probably are very similar in terms of their consequences domestically. Obviously, different for the source countries. I mean, cannabis has always been its own policy sphere, its own market. I mean, violence around cannabis markets has been very modest throughout the history of US drug markets, whereas cocaine markets have been quite violent. I mean, there are a whole series of differences across markets that seem relevant for the extrapolating the consequences of legalization. The cannabis market is a mass market. The cocaine market is relatively concentrated. I think those are important differences in terms of what are the likely consequences. I remain entirely agnostic about whether society, the US would be better off with a legal versus illegal cocaine market. I've no doubt that cocaine use would increase, cocaine dependence would increase. How one trades off the increase in health-related problems against the decrease in crime. My line about this has always been, only a University of Chicago economist thinks that you can convert all this into some money value and make a cost-benefit calculation. It remains impossible to make confident, even rough projections of what the consequences of legalization of cocaine would be. And it's very difficult then to think about how you would compare the pre-legalization and post-legalization regimes, and the consequences would be very different for different population groups. As a middle-class parent, I would worry a lot more that my kid would get into trouble if I were an inner-city resident and could imagine that the neighborhood would no longer have street markets in cocaine. I might have a very different view of it.
Yeah, and from there's a pragmatic question, and from a diplomatic perspective and as a diplomatic historian, it's very hard to envision any scenario where you get towards a regulated transnational flow of cocaine. And the idea that Colombia or Mexico could unilaterally make a decision which would matter for the U.S. It couldn't. Even if they did legalize domestically, that doesn't matter. You can't. This goes all the way back to the 1912 convention. You can't force a commodity on a country that doesn't want to import it, right? So how could you envision the chain of events that would lead towards legalized cocaine markets internationally? I really struggle to envision it. And then also the sense, you look at populations in Colombia and Mexico, very conservative on this as well, right?
Right. No, I agree entirely. I think, unfortunately, for Mexico, its drug problem is basically a consequence of American decisions and American behavior. And there's not much it can do on its own to deal with that problem. And as you say, the convention and the populations are very conservative. It's so fascinating that Uruguay has legalized cannabis, given that the population, I think 60% were definitely opposed to it, and it's basically indulging a sort of charismatic and popular president who was determined to do it. But no, there's surprisingly little support for drug policy reform, as we usually use that term, in Latin America.
And before we go back to the organized crime question, what do you think about Germany's legalization? Because you made the point at the beginning that once one state starts, it draws other states. Do you think that'll happen in Europe?
Oh, certainly. And the fact that it's Germany, no one thinks of Germany as irresponsible. If the Dutch do it, well, they're Dutch. But Germany is a very responsible and sober. Drink too much beer, but it's basically a very sober society. If they do it, then I think it really changes the calculus in many European countries. And the truth is, if Germany does it, then a very large number of countries have access. People in many countries will have easy access to legal marijuana. I don't know how many countries it neighbors on, but it's a large number. So I think it transforms. I have been surprised that the legalization of cannabis in the US has had so little resonance in Europe to date. And it's interesting. The only reason Germany is doing it is really, in a way, the peculiar nature of the coalition that came to power, and the fact that one of those parties had made a commitment to cannabis legalization. It's not as though this is a movement that is sweeping public opinion in Germany. It is the Greens, if I remember correctly, the Greens had said they were going to legalize cannabis if they came to power, and there they are.
And I think it goes to that point. Europe, to some degree, never had the US drug war, maybe with the exception of Sweden, we could say. But markets here aren't that. It's not a top 20 issue for most people.
Right. No, it is not such a salient issue. I agree.
And actually, it makes me think of on this side of the world, sort of. You've written in the past about Afghanistan and whether the supply of opium from Afghanistan can be cut. Do you want to make any prognostications on what the new regime may mean, or whether history will rhyme or repeat itself?
I was surprised that after taking power, the Taliban announced that it would prohibit opium production. The first couple of weeks, they said maybe only once, maybe twice, but clearly they've backed away from that. And I mean, a country which is plunged into economic disaster, the notion that you would then cut off the largest single source of agricultural earnings is just would almost, it'd have to be suicidal, a suicidal regime to do that. So I can't see the circumstances in the near future under which there would be that they would bring back the prohibition on opium growing. I don't know if 5 years from now things are stable, maybe they'll be able to indulge their preference for that. But I do think it's a long way off before that could happen.
So if we maybe zoom out a bit then again and just back to your work and your the evolution of your thinking on, say, organized crime, how do you think organized criminal markets have changed over the last 3-4 decades?
So I mean the level of violence in the producing countries is in a way stunning. Producing and traffic, I should actually give more emphasis to trafficking. The Mexican homicide rates, predominantly related to the drug trafficking, are horrifying. And the brutality of them, I mean, they're not just killings, they're torture and killings, decapitation. I mean, I won't go on, but the violence is extraordinary. And then one of the interesting phenomena is how you get to the U.S. border and the violence comes to an end. I mean, El Paso on one side and Juarez on the other side, and Juarez. In 1 year, Juarez had more homicides per capita than any other city in the world, and there were 2 killings in El Paso in the same year. I mean, it is fascinating that these Mexican organizations, which are so effectively violent in Mexico, are so careful on the other side of the border. And just a reminder that these homicide rates are evidence of a failed state in Mexico. And this administration, with a very different attitude, is just as ineffective in controlling homicide as its aggressive, corrupt predecessors were. I will admit I'm rambling in my answer to your question. I'm not sure I do have a concise answer to that, but I would say that the high level of violence in Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, and Central America around the drug trade is probably the most important and troubling aspect of the drug markets globally. I mean, they're so different from the drug problems in any other part of the world. I mean, drug-related violence in the US is fairly moderate. As I say, I don't think I have a nice, concise answer to your perfectly good question.
But I think it speaks on a truth, right? It would be very few people who would say the solution to drug markets in Asia is legalization, right? Because it's just the level of violence and the level of state. It's such a different set of markets, and how they operate is so different than Latin America. It's only in Latin America where you see that extreme. Okay, people say it around Afghanistan, etc. But it's really Latin America where you see the extremity of violence that people go for we have to do something. We have to do something that's completely outside the box. But I think it goes back to the earlier point that imagine the economic shocks to the communities that are reliant on drug markets if you were to legalize, or if you were to radically change policy in the morning. Those would be the ones who would suffer significantly as well. Would that be right?
I mean, those countries would suffer, but in the context of a $1 trillion economy as Mexico has, drug markets are small, modest. I mean, I $10-15 billion GDP contribution from drug markets. It's 1%. I mean, it's very unevenly distributed. It employs a lot of people. I mean, it is surprising how many people are involved in drug trafficking in Mexico, given that they're not retailing. It is, and they're not basically involved in the growing. They're just involved in this trafficking. But we're talking about probably hundreds of thousands of people involved. But I mean, it's not. Whereas for Afghanistan, the heroin trade is of macroeconomic significance. I don't think for any of the Latin American countries it would be anywhere near as large a share of GDP as that.
No, and I probably more mean towards the communities that are just completely outlier. They sit outside the mainstream of, say, the Colombian economy. They live in very remote areas. If you were to cut off the coca trade, it's not clear what they would do. They'd probably just be forced to move to the cities.
Well, yeah, it could lead to more migration. Coca farmers don't make a lot more than banana farmers in their region. I mean, that's one of the insights from economics, that drug refiners pay what they need to keep land and labor in coca farming, and that's just sort of enough more than you can earn from the next best legal crop. I don't think it's about immiserating communities in the Andes if the cocaine trade were to disappear. I mean, there'd be some loss of income, but not, I think, dramatic.
Okay, so maybe for the last point, a place close to my heart, but also my organization GI works a lot on multilateral level. You've worked closely with the UN, and you've worked a lot with UNODC and predecessor organizations over the years. What do you think is the future for multilateral drugs and crime control?
The conventions are not unimportant, but they're not the drivers of drug policy. I mean, if you take away the conventions, would national governments act very differently? And I think the answer is, in large part, no. I mean, the countries like China and Russia, which are aggressive about drug matters, are not aggressive, would continue to be aggressive even without effective enforcement of treaties. And many African countries reflect their societies as being quite conservative about these things. So I think the treaties, facilitate the prohibition, but they're not the principal drivers of prohibition as a choice or even as an enforced policy. I have very little sense that CND is important, seems to argue year after year about fairly marginal issues. Does ketamine get on the list or not? Should cut be there or not? So I mean, it may be that I'm not deeply enough involved in that sphere, but I don't think of them as central actors. I'm involved with UNODC in sort of scientific advisory committee on the World Drug Report, and I think that the World Drug Report is a useful document, but I don't otherwise really have much connection with UNODC as a policy agency.
Yeah, I think the CND and others have been inflated into being these, to use an expression that's often said, the war room of the war on drugs. When actually, if you trace it back, it's like any multilateral mechanism. It's a place for states to come together and talk. It's not very good at enforcing its will on member states. It certainly seems to be undergoing a continued process of fragmentation now. Do you think that fragmentation can coexist? I think I know the answer based on what you've said, that it's not going to change member states' policies one way or the other. But as it fragments or the policy terrain widens, do you think it continues to have a relevance?
Yeah, I mean, it is. Cannabis it is fascinating. First of all, that the world's leading hawk becomes the world's leading legalizer. I mean, to me, it's reinforced this sense that cannabis was always its own domain and needed to be treated separately from cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, etc. So I think that in a way, this has just reinforced that sense that that's separate, and the core of the international system is around other drugs. So no, I don't think the fragmentation is creating great tension.
That's it for this episode of Crime Beyond Borders. I'd like to thank Professor Peter Reuter again for joining me today. You can find the link to our website, giad.lse.ac.uk, in the summary to this show. On there you can find links to various papers, from corruption and illicit tobacco trades to cybercrime as an essential element in transnational counterfeiting schemes. Remember that it's all peer-reviewed and free to access. You can also find our previous episodes on urban peace, the environment, and the special episode on Brazil. We're also on Twitter @IllicitEcons. On LinkedIn, you can become a member of the Illicit Economies and Organised Crime Researchers and Policy Professionals group, where hundreds of organised crime experts from around the world engage in discussions on the latest research in organised crime. We'll be back in a few weeks with another episode of Crime Beyond Borders from GI-TOC and the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime. I'm John Collins. Thanks for listening.